June 1944. Saipan was burning. Smoke rose from the shattered ridges, while the sound of machine guns rolled like thunder through the valleys. The Japanese defensive lines had collapsed, and chaos had taken its place. Among the wreckage of bunkers and palm groves, a group of Japanese women in torn medical uniforms dragged the wounded toward a half-collapsed trench. One of them, a young field nurse named Aika, pressed her trembling hands against the bleeding shoulder of a soldier twice her size. His breath came in sharp bursts, mixing with the stench of mud, oil, and gunpowder. Above them, American planes passed so low that their propellers bent the palm fronds. Every roar shook the earth. The women had been told that capture meant torture. Japanese propaganda had repeated it endlessly. The Americans show no mercy. Better to die for the emperor. So when the gunfire faded and the footsteps of approaching boots echoed across the sand, Aiko shut her eyes. She whispered a prayer and reached for the morphine vial hidden in her sleeve, the last escape, the final obedience. But the footsteps didn't bring executioners. They brought silence. Then came an unfamiliar voice shouting in English, "Medic, we've got survivors here." The accent was sharp, but the tone was steady, almost gentle. Aiko opened her eyes to see a figure kneeling beside her, a U.S. Army corpsman, young, sweat-streaked, his rifle slung behind him. He looked at her patient first, not at her. Without a word, he pulled out a canteen and held it toward her. The water shimmered in the sunlight. She stared at it. Frozen. Reports from Saipan confirmed that over 29,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, while nearly 1,000 women, mostly nurses and clerks, were captured alive. Many expected mass executions. Instead, American medics triaged them alongside their own wounded. The shock was instant and disorienting for these women, trained to believe mercy was weakness. The first drink of water from an enemy hand felt more terrifying than any bullet. Aiko finally reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal canteen. The corpsman nodded once, then turned to bandage another wounded man without waiting for thanks. The war around them still raged, but something invisible had shifted an idea, a truth. A seed of contradiction planted in a battlefield soaked with lies. And when the trucks arrived to take the survivors away, Aiko looked back at the corpsman's shadow and wondered, why would the enemy save us? The trucks rumbled down toward the shoreline, their engines groaning under the weight of the wounded. The air smelled of salt, fuel, and something new, disinfectant. Aiko sat wedged between two other nurses, hands pressed to her knees, the canteen still damp in her grasp. Around her, wounded Japanese soldiers moaned softly, and American medics worked methodically, checking pulses, tightening tourniquets, giving morphine shots without discrimination. No one shouted, no one struck. It was a silence filled with confusion at the beach. Tents had been raised in neat rows, makeshift triage stations, where the sand was dark with blood. Under the canvas roofs, U.S. medics moved in a rhythm that was both clinical and human. Aiko was guided toward one of the tables. A nurse in a white armband pointed to her arm. "Infection," the woman said simply, and began cleaning the wound. The sting of alcohol made Aiko flinch. The American nurse noticed and slowed her pace. "It's okay," she murmured. Words Aiko couldn't understand, but somehow felt. Unofficial records from Saipan. U.S. field hospitals treated over 3,000 Japanese wounded after the battle. Many were civilians or auxiliary personnel. For American medics, it was duty. For the Japanese captives, it was dissonance. They had been taught mercy did not exist beyond the empire's borders. Yet here, in enemy hands, they were being saved instead of executed. One American corpsman noticed, her gaze fixed on a tin tray of bandages, and smiled awkwardly. "You're safe now," he said, though she didn't understand the words. His tone carried something universal, sincerity. Then he handed her a small piece of bread. She stared, Unsure if it was a test, he gestured, "Eat." Hesitant, she took a bite. It was soft, salty, and foreign. Tears welled up before she could stop them. As the tide rolled in, the medics moved on to the next patient. Aiko remained seated, watching them work. The smell of iodine replaced the stench of decay. In her mind, the faces of her instructors flickered, the ones who had sworn the enemy would desecrate them. But these enemies didn't desecrate. They disinfected. When a shadow fell across her, she looked up. Another soldier, helmet tilted, motioning her toward the docks. A hospital ship waited offshore, engines humming, Red Cross flags fluttering. Her journey into disbelief had just begun. The small landing craft rocked against the side of the great white vessel, its metal hull glinting in the afternoon sun. Aiko clutched the railing, her knuckles pale, salt spray hitting her face as she stared up at the words painted on the side, USS Bountiful. The red crosses gleamed against the hull like something out of a dream. To her, this wasn't rescue, it was captivity, wrapped in confusion. Every instinct told her to fear what waited above. American sailors leaned over the railings, helping the wounded aboard. Their movements were efficient, unhurried. No mocking, no shouting. One offered his hand to Aiko. She hesitated, then took it. The roughness of his glove contrasted with the care in his grip. Her boots hit the polished deck, and she froze. Everything smelled wrong: bleach, steel, coffee. The sea air was too clean, the order too precise. Inside, the corridors were lined with stretchers. Nurses in white uniforms, faces calm but focused, moved quickly between beds. When Aiko was seated on a cot, a doctor examined her arm. He asked questions she couldn't understand, then nodded to a translator. "You'll be fine," the translator said in halting Japanese. "You are safe here." The words felt heavy. Unbelievable. Official naval records show that U.S. hospital ships like the USS Bountiful treated thousands of enemy wounded across the Pacific under strict Geneva Convention guidelines. Prisoners, civilians, even captured nurses were given the same care as American troops. For many Japanese POWs, this first contact with the enemy's mercy shattered years of indoctrination. Aiko watched as an American nurse adjusted her blanket and placed a cup of something warm beside her. Coffee. She recognized it from ration rumors. It was bitter, rich, alien. The woman smiled faintly before walking away. No guards, no chains, only the hum of engines and the sound of waves hitting the hull. That night, Aiko couldn't sleep. She lay awake under a clean sheet, eyes tracing the lines of the ceiling. The steady vibration of the ship felt like breathing, calm, controlled, alive. Outside, she could hear the faint murmur of sailors talking about home, about baseball, about going back. In that moment, she realized they didn't see her as an enemy. They saw her as human. When dawn came, the loudspeaker announced their arrival. Guam. The real captivity was about to begin. The dock at Guam shimmered under the tropical sun, the air thick with salt and diesel. As the hospital ship's gangway lowered, rows of American soldiers waited to receive the wounded and the captured. Aiko stepped off slowly, her eyes darting from the palm trees to the neat military tents arranged in geometric precision. Everything looked too organized to command alien kind of order. After the chaos of Saipan, she and the other nurses were guided toward an intake area, where a long wooden table divided captors from captives. Behind it, clerks in khaki uniforms sorted papers, stamped forms, and spoke in quick English. The process was mechanical yet strangely polite. When ICO's turn came, a translator gestured to her satchel. "Open, please," he said softly. She obeyed, half expecting her few possessions: a comb, a letter, a piece of cloth, to be thrown away. Instead, the clerk catalogued each item carefully, labeling it with her name. He even paused when he found her letter, folded and brittle from the jungle's humidity. "You can keep this," he said, setting it gently aside. The gesture hit her harder than any insult could have. Back home, her superiors would have burned personal letters for being sentimental distractions. Official documents show that Allied camps in Guam processed more than 140,000 Japanese prisoners by war's end. Regulations required photo identification, medical screening, and humane treatment under the Geneva Convention. For Japanese captives, especially women, the sheer civility of it felt surreal. They had been told they would be stripped, humiliated, executed. Instead, they were photographed, bandaged, and fed. As the camera flashed, Aiko flinched. The clerk looked puzzled. "Identification only," he said kindly, lowering the lens. The woman behind her whispered, "They treat us better than home did." Aiko wanted to disagree, but she couldn't. By sunset, the intake was complete. The women were led to a barracks ringed with wire, but open to the breeze. Inside, straw mats lined the floor, clean and dry. At the far end, stood a table with something miraculous on it, loaves of soft white bread. Still warm from the camp bakery, Aiko reached for one, her fingers trembling. The crust cracked under her touch, releasing a smell she'd never known. The scent of life continuing in a place where death had ruled for years. Tomorrow morning, she'd discover what mercy tasted like. The next morning began not with sirens, but with a whistle, 2 sharp notes echoing across the camp yard. The prisoners lined up, expecting inspection, punishment, or orders shouted through interpreters. Instead, a corporal in rolled-up sleeves pointed toward the mess tent. "Breakfast," he said, motioning them forward. The word barely registered. For months, food had meant boiled rice, sometimes moldy, sometimes nothing. Inside the tent, the smell stopped Aiko mid-step. It wasn't smoke or rot, it was warmth. Rows of American cooks ladled something thick and golden onto metal trays. Beside it lay soft white bread, and next to that, a small spoonful of peanut butter glistening like amber. The women exchanged uncertain glances. Was this a test? Poison? Mockery? An American sergeant noticed their hesitation. He took a slice himself, spread the peanut butter, and took a bite right in front of them. "Eat," he said, grinning slightly. "It's good." They followed cautiously. The first taste was overwhelming, sweet, salty, rich. It clung to the tongue, heavy with oil and sugar. Aiko chewed slowly, tears stinging her eyes before she understood why. For the first time since the war began, her stomach didn't twist from hunger. Around her, other women broke into quiet sobs, laughing between mouthfuls. Military records show that by 1944, every American POW camp rationed over 3,500 calories per day, 10 times the average Japanese frontline ration. Bread, butter, canned fruit, and coffee were common. For prisoners raised in scarcity, this abundance wasn't comfort. It was psychological disarmament. The enemy wasn't starving them, they were feeding them better than their own army had. Aiko remembered the training camp in Yokohama, where a commanding officer had forced nurses to share one rice bowl between 4. "Discipline builds loyalty," he'd said. Looking at the Americans now, their easy laughter, their overflowing plates, she realized discipline wasn't the same as cruelty. As the women finished, a radio crackled to life in the corner of the tent. Jazz music drifted through tinny speakers, alien yet strangely soft. They froze again, unsure if listening was allowed. Aiko stared toward the sound, the rhythm, the brass, the laughter bleeding through static. It didn't sound like war. It sounded like another world entirely. That sound would haunt her all afternoon, until she realized the Americans weren't done surprising them yet. The radio crackled again that afternoon, its antenna bent slightly by wind and salt air. Aiko sat on the edge of her bunk, still tasting peanut butter on her tongue as the music filled the barracks. It wasn't marching drums or propaganda hymns, it was melody. The brass swung like laughter, the drums rolled with ease. Later she'd learn the name, Glenn Miller's In the Mood. For now, it was just noise from another planet. The guards didn't shout for silence. They didn't switch it off. One even whistled along while stacking crates near the fence. The women exchanged uneasy glances. The sound of joy in a prison camp made no sense. One muttered, "They're mocking us." Another shook her head slowly. "No, they're just living." For hours, the music drifted in and out of static. Somewhere in the distance, an American shouted about a baseball game, and laughter followed. It was surreal, almost cruel in its normalcy. Back in Japan, radio broadcasts were filled with sorrow, casualty lists, patriotic marches, commands to endure. Here, the enemy danced between chores. According to archived records from U.S. Army entertainment divisions, over 200 hours of morale music were broadcast weekly across Pacific bases. Jazz, swing, even love songs were considered medicine for discipline. What they didn't plan was how those same sounds would reach ears and reshape perceptions. Aiko found herself tapping her finger against the wood, matching the rhythm. She stopped, startled by her own movement. What right did she have to feel something pleasant here? But it wasn't rebellion. It was recognition. The war had painted these men as monsters, yet here they were, humming tunes about love and weekends. It fractured something inside her that obedience alone could never mend. That night, a guard passed by the barracks, humming the same melody. When he noticed Aiko watching from the window, he paused and raised a hand, not as command, but as greeting. She bowed instinctively. No words, just two people acknowledging sound in the middle of silence. The next morning, the camp loudspeaker called for assembly. Red Cross workers had arrived. Translators would help prisoners write letters home. ICO's heartbeat quickened. After years of censorship and fear, she might finally speak beyond the fence. The Red Cross tent stood near the camp's gate, canvas flapping in the sea wind. A table lined with forms, ink bottles, and translators marked the start of another impossible scene. Aiko hesitated at the entrance, clutching her hands to still the tremor in her fingers. Around her, other women whispered nervously, this couldn't be real. Back home, even civilian mail was censored. Soldiers' families received letters cut apart with scissors, sentences missing like amputated thoughts. Freedom to write was not a concept. It was fiction. An American interpreter, a young Nisei, Japanese-American, smiled softly. You can write, he said in slow Japanese. Anything. Family, home, feelings, no punishment. His accent was strange, but his tone was gentle, the kind that makes disbelief feel small. He handed her a sheet of thin stationery and nodded toward the benches. The women stared at the paper as though it were gold leaf. ICO's hand hovered over the page for minutes before the first word came. Ha, mother. Her pen trembled. How could she describe where she was? Would they even believe her? That she was alive, that Americans had treated her wounds, fed her, given her music and bread. It sounded like betrayal of everything she'd sworn to defend. Statistics from International Red Cross archives record over 60,000 prisoner letters processed monthly by late 1944. Despite Japan's fractured communication networks, most never reached their destination. But the act of writing itself restored something crucial: identity. Across the tent, the Nisei translator moved from table to table, answering hesitant questions. You don't have to talk about war, he told one. Just say you're alive. The simplicity of it broke something inside Aiko. Tears blurred her ink. She wrote carefully, I am safe. They treat us kindly. Do not worry. When she handed the page over, the interpreter stamped it with a red seal and placed it into a canvas mailbag. We'll try, he said quietly. She bowed low. Outside, the sun hit her face for the first time that day. The same guard who'd hummed yesterday's song stood nearby, hands in his pockets, pretending not to watch. The moment felt suspended, kindness disguised as routine. That night, Lying under the thin blanket, Aiko stared at her ink-stained fingers. Gratitude scared her more than hunger ever had. Tomorrow, she'd face something harder than captivity: guilt. The night settled heavy over the camp, the humid air pressing close like a blanket of memory. A single lantern swayed above the barracks, casting moving shadows across the faces of women who could not sleep. Aiko sat upright on her bunk, her letter already sent, her mind trapped in a loop of disbelief. The Americans had not only spared her, they had fed her, healed her, let her speak. Gratitude felt treacherous. Every act of kindness carried the weight of betrayal. From the far corner, one of the nurses whispered, "If our officers saw this, they'd call us traitors." Another murmured back, "But they're not here, are they?" A faint laugh rippled through the room, brittle, uncertain, almost painful. Aiko reached into her pocket and pulled out the small comb she had managed to keep since Saipan. Its teeth were bent, its handle chipped, but it was hers. She began to brush through her tangled hair slowly, remembering the training lectures about loyalty and sacrifice. Better to die than be captured, her commander had said. Yet here she was, alive, because of the enemy's mercy, post-war. Psychological studies describe this exact state as cognitive dissonance of survival. The mind rejecting good treatment when it comes from the wrong source. Many Japanese POWs described it as a sickness, shame mixed with dependence. Kindness felt heavier than violence, one survivor later wrote, echoing what Aiko now felt in her chest. Outside, a guard's flashlight swept across the yard. The beam flickered through the cracks in the barracks wall. Aiko froze, half expecting a reprimand for staying awake. But the light passed gently, pausing only long enough to check they were safe. Even that gesture confused her further mercy as vigilance. On the bunk beside her, another woman whispered, "I dreamed they let us go." Aiko didn't respond. The dream was too dangerous, too tempting. Instead, she stared at the lantern flame until it blurred. The realization forming in her mind was more frightening than the war itself, that the enemy, the same men she was taught to despise, had become her teachers in decency. At dawn, a voice echoed outside the barracks, "Volunteers needed at the infirmary." Aiko turned toward the sound, her heartbeat quickening. Tomorrow, she would touch the wounded again, but this time, under a different flag. The next morning smelled of antiseptic and rain. The infirmary sat at the far edge of the camp, its roof patched with canvas, its doorway marked by a faded red cross. Aiko stepped inside with two other women, hands folded in front of them, unsure whether they were truly being asked to help or simply tested for obedience. Inside, the noise was soft, not the chaos of battle hospitals, but the steady rhythm of human care. American medics moved between rows of cots, checking pulses, changing bandages, logging temperatures on clipboards. When the women entered, heads turned. One doctor, sleeves rolled to his elbows, gave a small nod. "We can use the help," he said. A translator repeated the words in careful Japanese. Assist, clean, replace, record. Aiko moved to a bed where a wounded Japanese soldier lay motionless. His chest rose and fell shallowly. She began to clean the edges of the wound with trembling hands. The smell of carbolic acid and metal hit her nose, the same smell that haunted her through the war. But here it meant safety, not horror, throughout the day. She worked alongside American medics who treated her not as a prisoner, but as a colleague. When she reached for supplies, someone passed them wordlessly. When she made a mistake, a calm voice corrected her, never shouting, never shaming. That simple respect disarmed her more effectively than any weapon could have. By afternoon, she noticed something stranger still. The Americans allowed her to treat other captives freely, trusting her with scalpels, bandages, and even morphine doses. In Japanese field hospitals, such trust would never have been given to a low-ranking nurse. Here, hierarchy dissolved into efficiency. "They trusted us," she later recalled, "with medicine, not rifles." Official reports show that U.S. POW camps often recruited cooperative prisoners as medical aids. They weren't propaganda tools, they were practical solutions. Evidence that dignity improved morale and survival rates. As Aiko cleaned her instruments at sunset, one of the doctors approached her. "Good work," he said, dropping something small into her palm, a wrapped piece of chocolate. "For energy." She stared at it, speechless. The glossy surface reflected the golden light from the window. It was sweet, foreign, and utterly undeserved. Yet it felt like recognition, the first unspoken bridge between enemies. That night, she couldn't decide which was more impossible, forgiveness or chocolate. The small square rested in her palm like a secret. Aiko turned it over, staring at the smooth wrapper stamped with a single word she didn't understand: Hershey. Around her, the barracks buzzed with quiet evening talk. The soft scrape of spoons against tin bowls, the drone of insects outside. She waited until the lanterns dimmed before peeling it open. The faint crackle of paper sounded louder than gunfire. The smell hit her first, sweet, warm, and unfamiliar. She broke off a corner and placed it on her tongue. It melted instantly, coating her mouth in sugar and bitterness, softness and depth. For a heartbeat, she forgot the war, the camps, the propaganda. The taste overwhelmed her. Tears welled before she realized she was crying. Across the room, another nurse whispered, "What is it?" Aiko answered simply, "It's peace." For American soldiers, chocolate was nothing unusual. The U.S. Army had issued more than 600 million Hershey bars during the war, packed into rations for morale and quick calories. But for the women who'd survived starvation, this was beyond food. It was a shock of abundance, sweetness in a world built on iron and ash. She sat quietly, letting the chocolate dissolve, thinking about what it represented. Back home, kindness had been rationed as tightly as rice. Orders had been screamed, mercy forbidden. Every act of endurance had been built on fear. Here, the enemy handed her sugar with no expectation. No bargain. When the doctor who'd given it passed by, she stood quickly and bowed low. He only smiled and said, "You earned it." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, respect, not pity. That single moment bent the walls around her idea of the world. Later that night, she wrote a few words in her diary. They gave us sweetness, while our own gave us pain. She folded the page carefully and hid it under her blanket. Outside, the guard's footsteps faded into distance. Inside, she felt warmth she couldn't name. The same warmth that came not from victory, but from being seen as human again. The next morning, a rumor spread through the camp: repatriation. The war was ending, and they might soon go home. Aiko held the empty chocolate wrapper tight in her hand, afraid to let go of what it meant. The announcement came at sunrise, shouted over the crackle of a loudspeaker. Repatriation order confirmed. The words rippled through the camp like a tremor. The war was over. The women stood frozen in the courtyard, unsure whether to cheer, cry, or simply breathe. Aiko pressed her hands together, still holding the folded chocolate wrapper she'd saved. It was soft now, the edges worn from being hidden in her pocket. That day, the U.S. medics gathered their Japanese assistants for one final meeting inside the infirmary. The same doctor who had first handed her chocolate smiled faintly. "You did good work," he said, his voice measured but kind. "You helped save lives." Through the translator, the words felt heavier than metals. No applause, no salute, just sincerity. It was enough. The departing prisoners were issued new clothing, their names checked against long lists. When ICOS was called, she hesitated at the gate, turning back toward the tents, the mess hall, the radio that had once terrified her. So much of what she had believed had burned away here. She had arrived expecting cruelty and found decency instead. That truth would follow her longer than the scars on her arm. Official records note that, between late 1945 and 1946, More than 35,000 Japanese POWs were repatriated under Allied supervision. Most left quietly, still uncertain how to reconcile what they had experienced. Some spoke of gratitude. Others never mentioned it again. For the women, it was more complex. Their captivity had not broken them, but remade them. As Aiko boarded the transport ship, American sailors handed out paper cups of coffee. She accepted one, remembering the first time she'd tasted it aboard the USS Bountiful. It was still bitter, still foreign. But now it meant something else, a bridge between who she was and who she'd become. On deck, she turned one last time to watch the camp shrink into the horizon. Beside her, another nurse whispered, "We came here as enemies." Aiko nodded slowly. "We leave as witnesses." She slipped the chocolate wrapper into her diary and closed it. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, a quiet, gray reflection of everything they'd endured. The next sunrise would belong to Japan again, but the lesson, she knew, had come from the other side. Tokyo, 1946. The city was a skeleton of steel and smoke, but small pieces of life had begun to return. Children played among broken tram lines, merchants sold bread made of barley and hope, and the morning air carried the scent of survival. In a narrow apartment built from scavenged lumber, Aiko unpacked the few things she'd carried home: her diary, a nurse's badge, and a tiny crumpled chocolate wrapper. She placed it beside a photograph of her parents and sat quietly, the sound of distant hammers filling the silence. Her family stared when she told them what had happened in captivity. They waited for horror stories, for tales of cruelty and revenge. Instead, she spoke of medicine, music, and mercy. Her father frowned. "The Americans?" he asked softly. "They did all this." She nodded. "They treated us better than our own commanders did." The words felt treasonous, yet true. For months, she couldn't sleep without hearing the hum of the camp generator. The faint swing music, drifting through her dreams. In a city buried under ashes, that memory was almost comforting. Reports from post-war Japan reveal that over 60% of returning POWs described humane treatment by Allied forces, a revelation that stunned a nation raised on fear and propaganda. For many, kindness proved harder to process than defeat. Aiko began working as a nurse again, this time in a Tokyo hospital run by both Japanese and American staff. The first time she treated a US soldier, her hands shook. Then he thanked her in perfect Japanese, and something inside her eased. The war had ended, but the lesson was still unfolding. Decency could cross uniforms, languages, even oceans. One evening her younger sister found her sitting by the window, the chocolate wrapper held between her fingers. "Why keep it?" she asked. Aiko smiled faintly. "Because it reminds me that hate isn't the only thing we brought home." Outside, the streetlights flickered on, new bulbs powered by American generators. The city glowed weakly, like memory trying to heal. Aiko looked toward the sky where Allied bombers had once flown and whispered, "You defeated us kindly." She slipped the wrapper back into her diary, closed it, and exhaled. War had erased nations. But kindness, quiet, unrecorded, persistent, had rebuilt one soul at a time.